aquaculturists who make their livelihood on these waters, and how choices we make can impact them very significantly. So why the concern? Well, we focus almost solely on bivalve shellfish, even though there's a lot of different animals that people eat from the marine environment. And the reason why we pay particular attention to bivalve shellfish, so that's all the clams and the oysters and the mussels that are scallops that are in the water, it's because these are filter feeders. And that because of that, they pose a unique risk for people who are eating them. We'll get more into that in just a moment. Also, people are more likely to get sick from eating raw or undercooked shellfish, and very often that's the case with shellfish versus other food. You don't eat raw chicken or raw beef. So some of the things we're going to talk about here, you're much easier to become sick from eating these shellfish than other foods. And there's a whole host of ways you can get sick off of eating shellfish: viruses, bacteria, biotoxins, even things that people are now investigating, microplastics and pharmaceuticals. There's a whole host of things out there that we're tasked with making sure that people aren't getting these when they eat their shellfish. So the general philosophy is, if it's clean water, then you have clean shellfish. So our work is, for the most part, based on making sure that the water is clean where the shellfish live. And on the other side of that, means dirty water means closures, DMR putting in closures, and harvesters losing out on that opportunity to harvest. And some of these closures are year-round closures, and others might only be say after a rainstorm or during an algal bloom. So it's limited in duration, but that's a big deal, saying limited duration, if that means somebody's just not working for a week. All right, so I'm going to play a short video the Washington State Department of Health put out to explain filter feeding. I'm not sure how loud this is. I'll turn it down a little bit. So this is a little experiment that was done that shows how shellfish filter feed. Be up in just one moment. So there's going to be a number of different tanks. There's 4 tanks. The first one is just seawater, so that's a control tank. The second tank has 20 mussels. The third tank has 40 mussels. And the last tank's also empty. So the first 3 are all given algae. So this is algae, but this can be simulating any kind of pollution. Algae is just easy to see in the tanks. So after 5 minutes, the 3 tanks with the algae still look the same. But 15 minutes later, you can start to notice the tank that has the most mussels is starting to look cleaner. Now, once it's 30 minutes, you can really see the difference, even both tanks with mussels versus the tank with no mussels. And that algae, it's not dying or going away, it's going inside the shellfish. And now the tank with the most mussels almost looks the same as the tank that has no algae in it. Then after an hour, they're basically the same. More or less all the algae put into that tank with the 40 mussels is inside of the shellfish. I'll stop it here, but by this point, now both tanks with mussels more or less have all that algae inside the shellfish. And the takeaway for this is algae's fine. That's not going to, but we'll talk about that later, depending on the kind of algae. But for the most part, algae's not a problem if that's inside the shellfish. But if that's not algae, but that's bacteria from human waste, animal waste, or if that's chemicals from whatever the source might be, viruses, whatever it might be, that's now inside those shellfish. They're collecting it, and eventually it'll come out. But for a time, it's going to accumulate that within the shellfish. And then if you take that and you eat it raw, you eat it undercooked, whatever was in there for for bacteria, if you don't cook it out all the way, that's gonna make you sick. And then if it's other things, like we're gonna get to about certain biotoxins, you can't even cook it out. So that shellfish are in our coastal waters, and they're indiscriminate. They're just pulling in whatever's in that water, whatever the source. And if it's something that we put in that water, it's now inside the shellfish, and now we're going to take it out of the water. Now we're going to eat it. So we're eating whatever it is that we just dumped into the ocean. All right. So what does it mean when we say clean water? Clean water equals clean shellfish. So for us at DMR, that means, and for the sake of public health, it means evidence that water isn't contaminated by fecal material. So that means human poop and warm-blooded animal poop. That's what it comes down to. So whether that's birds or pets or farm animals or wildlife, whatever it might be, whatever's along that shoreline, and we'll see in a second, it's more than even just what's on the shoreline, can get into that water and can get into that shellfish. And if we could see poop within that shellfish, there's not a one of us that would eat it, but it doesn't take very much at all bacteria to actually make it so that it's contaminated. We also look for evidence of marine biotoxins. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. That comes in 3 different groups. PSP, or paralytic shellfish poisoning, is what I think most people have heard about. We get the numbing of the lips and of the tongue, and hard to breathe. It can kill people. So that we'll talk more about where those come from later. But and then the last group is everything else, other deleterious substances. So that's the oil that maybe it's from industry, or maybe it's from what we're dumping outside. It's waste oil that we have from whatever source. It could be other chemicals, whether it's from a plant that's dumping that into the water, or whether it's just chemicals we have at our home that we're just dumping on our lawn rather than disposing of it properly, or dumping it into that stream behind our house, whatever it might be. And that reaching the shellfish. So most of the shellfish that are harvested in Maine waters are near shore, whether it's intertidal or in the subtidal, but real close to shore. There's some harvesting that happens offshore, but most of it's close to home. So that means it's going to be impacted by all kinds of different pollution sources. Some of them are outside of our individual control, what happens from urban runoff from factories or wastewater treatment plants. We personally don't have control over that. But a lot of the sources of this contamination, we have lots of control over. So whether that's agricultural, there's most of the farming done on the coast isn't done by big farms. It's done by individual homeowners who have just a small farm behind their house. So it can be things for like letting animals have access to the streams that then flow into the river, that flows into maybe a clam bed. Direct access to that. It could be leaving manure piles, keeping them along the shore. It can be things like our septic systems. Well, that septic system breaks and you don't want to deal with it. Well, that means that it's allowing raw sewage to seep into the coastal waters. It could be outhouses where you're not taking proper care of them. Lots of sources. But one that doesn't show up in here, and shame on them for not showing it, is the dog. So dogs have, I think, 2 big problems that happen, and I've seen it in a number of different towns. One of them is you have public access to parks, boat landings, whatever it might be, and dogs are allowed to be there. And you might have a place that has both public access for dogs, and it's also a public landing, and there are mud flats right there, and there are people trying to make a living on that mud flat. And there's times where we'll see dog waste on the boat landing, where at high tide, it's now submerged underwater, and just you're within sight of where someone tries to dig to make a living. And our closure threshold for areas is that if there's 31, they're called colony forming units, but 31 individual bacteria within every 100 mils of water, that's a travel shampoo bottle. That's just that small of amount. If there's 31 bacteria in that or greater than that, then we have to close that area. Well, one dog, its poop has 23 million of these kinds of bacteria per gram. So it doesn't take a lot of dogs chronically using the same place to pollute a big waterway. It's a serious issue. So we got to be very mindful about sharing those areas, particularly cleaning up after the dog, not letting them go in the water. And you got places where the tide's changing by 5-10 feet, so that you might let them poop 5 feet from the shore, but then at high tide, it's underwater. And the other issue is people throwing their dog waste down storm drains. They pick it up, put it in a dog bag. They see a storm drain, they throw it down there. I hear about that pretty frequently from towns, and they put up signs for that. So important considerations. I won't run through all these, but we have all kinds of different ways we classify waterways based off of that bacteria, from it's good water, anyone can use it, to no one can access it. And here's a map just showing the kind of idea of how complicated it can get from different kinds of pollution sources being in waterways, and how we can have to limit harvesters' access to these waters because of those pollution sources. And a lot of them are under our control, keeping our septic systems in order, not putting things like manure piles near the shore, dogs at parks, dogs at public landings. And then to complement that, I'll talk a little bit about marine biotoxins. It's kind of the other thing that causes these closures that impact shellfish harvesters. Here's some pictures, this kind of murky green in the middle. That's a very large algal bloom. This one you can see kind of this thick green, light green along the shore. That's another algal bloom. And then this bright green, that whole cove was full of algae. And then here's another one that's kind of more of a brownish color along the shore. These are all algal blooms. Algal blooms are quite common on the Maine coast. The problem happens when it's one of these three groups shown here. These ones are all ones that can produce toxins that you can't cook it out of the shellfish. The shellfish don't taste different. And unlike those pictures I showed you for these guys, you generally don't see them in the water either. So you don't have any warning signs other than following the closures that we implement. Algal blooms are, they're microscopic plants, so they're feeding off of nutrients. So the nutrients we're putting into water can have an impact on how large these blooms become. So if we're over fertilizing, or if it's washing off of streams and rivers, this can have impacts. A lot of towns will actually put in ordinances limiting nutrients, say fertilizer on lawn for the sake of this, or not letting the trees to get cut along the shorelines to limit how much runoff is happening. I'll skip over this slide, but point of this is people do get sick off of these biotoxins. There are times where people have died. It's always been by not heating our closures. And here's just a pretty graphic of how we the test in our lab. We used to use mice, and that was a big concern, because it involved killing thousands of mice throughout the year. We've completely gone to this other chemical method, so no mice die anymore, which is a great change in that. But as you can see, the blue along the shore here, these can be real large scale closures. They're species specific, so it's not like with water quality, where if there's bacteria in the water, we just close that area for all shellfish harvesting, whether that's an area around a park or around streams or whatever it might be because of contamination. With these biotoxins, these blooms, like I showed in those pictures, can be pretty extensive. Other times they're limited within a bay. And we test every species different. So some can be open while others are closed at times. And so that's a very quick survey of what the public health program does. So the big takeaways would be that we do have an impact for both water quality and biotoxins. especially with water quality, where our choices that we make about where we allow our dogs to use the bathroom, whether we make sure our septic systems are in working order. And it's not just along the beach or along the mud flat, but it's also up those streams and up those rivers that connect to it. So when we get rain, that all washes out. So even though you're not right on the waterfront, you still have to be mindful of it because it all flows to the ocean. All right. So that is the end of my talk, and I will hand it off to David.
Thank you, Brian. I hope everybody can hear me. You did a wonderful job. You touched on some of the stuff that I'll be touching on. Not to repeat it, but I guess it's in my little spiel I got. So I'll start. Dog waste is an environmental pollutant because we feed the dogs a rich protein diet. This makes their waste worse than wildlife because of what we feed them. In 1991, EPA placed it in the same category as herbicides, oil, grease, and toxic chemicals, making it a hazard waste. It's estimated that a single gram of waste can contain 23 million fecal coliform bacteria, which causes cramps, diarrhea, intestinal illness, and serious kidney disorder in humans and animals. In addition, dog waste is a common carrier of rootworm, hookworm, roundworm, tapeworm, and salmonella. The EPA estimated that 2 or 3 days worth of dropping from 100 dogs would contribute enough bacteria to temporarily close a bay and all surrounding watershed within 20 miles. Dog waste contains nitrogen and phosphates, which depletes oxygen levels that water-based life needs to survive. Also, it encourages the growth of harmful algae, which in turn goes on the mud, smothering clams, and contribute into deleting the oxygen levels. Plus, when it dies off, releases carbon in the water column. If dog waste is left unattended, it can leave a harmful bacteria up to 4 years in the ground with the possibility of leaching into a water table from rain or snow melting. One day of dog waste can produce 3/4 pound. It is recommended that people should not compost it in their backyard because you cannot produce enough heat to break down the pathogens. There's a lab now in Maine and Mount Vernon that is doing research on composting dog and cat waste. And also a lot of cities now are starting to put out dog waste containers because they're having a big problem with it and being in the landfills and not breaking down because they're in plastic bags and stuff. And and they're getting into the water quality problem of it too. So they're sending it off to a composting place where the temperature can be monitored. And the reason we should care about this is because our ocean provides 50 to 80% of our oxygen that we have on this planet. And not to mention that it does affect the clamming, and last year clamming industry was a $35 million industry for the state of Maine, and that's a lot of money, even though we're down on harvest this year. It still generates a lot of income for the state of Maine. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll pass it off to Matt. Yeah.
Great.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, David, for that great introduction, and same goes for you, Brian, for all the information you shared. So my name is Matt Bonner. I'm the Trails and Public Access Manager at Georges River Land Trust. For you guys who don't know, we're a nonprofit conservation organization based out of Rockland, and we care about conserving some of the most biodiverse, environmentally important landscapes in the area, And it's my job and great honor to build trails and make sure people can get out there to enjoy them. And so something that I am very frequently weighing in my mind is how to balance public access into the outdoors with impacting those environments. Of course, one of the greatest generators for support for conservation is intimately bringing or introducing people to nature so that they can see it firsthand and learn to appreciate it, especially folks that didn't grow up outside like a lot of us were fortunate to do so. And as is the repeated narrative in most things environmental related, is that our impact we have on the environment is much larger than we typically expect. Using trails as an example, we think of a single track hiking trail having a impact of 3 feet wide. In reality, a hiking trail's impact is 200 feet wide. And at least that's what's used oftentimes in environmental impact statements, because the sound we make, our presence, affects that of the wildlife around us. Same goes for our dogs. I'm sure many folks who own dogs, and being a dog lover myself, we take our dogs outside on trails. Great for them to sniff things, meet other dogs. But it's important that, like ourselves, we monitor the impact that they have on the environment. There's no point in building trails into some place like the Oyster River Bog here in Rockland if we're just going to do more damage than good. So something that we have been known for, is that my microphone doing that? David, any chance we could get you to mute your microphone real quick?
Do what, delete it? Come delete my microphone.
Oh, yeah, ask me.
Yeah.
I can do it on my end here.
Oh, cool.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
There we go. Oh, so something that Georges River Land Trust has been somewhat embarrassingly known for has been a place where people can let their dogs run free. This isn't true. This is something that when I came into my position, I had a number of people thank me for having trails that didn't require them to loose their dogs, standing next to a kiosk that says we require dogs to be on leash. And I understand the frustration people get sometimes because they want their dog to get exercise. And they love their dogs. People are starting to treat pets a little bit more like our children. But as they're having a nice conversation with me, I'll see them off on the side of the trail, using the bathroom, chasing animals. And it seems that in most things, people don't understand a lot of the facts that we've learned about today, things that they do have a large impact on the environment. Even if, the other day I saw someone laughing as their dog chased a flock of birds. And I'm like, well, those look kind of like migratory birds. I think they need their energy for, a lot of the large trips they're on. And we often see things as cute and fun without thinking more deeply into the impact they can have. And so I spend, not a lot of time, but I spend more time than the average person talking to people about these things. And it can be a difficult conversation to have because, it's never anything done maliciously. No one is laughing and like rubbing their hands together like, yes, I'm ruining local shellfish harvesting in the St. George River. It's just things done because they're the way they've always done it. No one ever wants to think that they're doing anything wrong or causing harm to the environment. Sometimes people can become aggressive, sometimes they just don't care. But oftentimes they don't know a lot of these facts. They don't know how easy it is for things like dog waste to persist in the environment and to end up in waterways, particularly when a lot of our trails are along the St. George River. And all it takes is one large rain event after someone's brought maybe a group of dogs, maybe a dog walker, or maybe that's just where they take their dog every day. And a lot of that waste is washed into the river and then is carried downstream. Everything flows downstream. It really is amazing how things can persist in the environment and how everything's affected. And so one of the largest, I shouldn't say largest, but one of our more recent issues we've had is at our Riverview Hayfields Preserve. And now we have 70 miles of trails and there's just 1 mile on the Riverview Hayfields Preserve. And a lot of our the fee-owned properties we have and conservation easements are for, I don't want to say for different purposes, but they sort of prioritize different environmental things. Old growth forest, great wetlands, and Riverview hayfields, which is a very important shoreland nesting bird area. Forgive me, I'm not the conservation staff person, but it's somewhere where it's our bobolink trail. It's where a very rare and very beautiful species of bird, bobolink, nest. And it's one of the very few locations left in the state of Maine where they can do so. And so one of our greatest priorities is protecting them and protecting that environment. If you ever get the chance to go there in June, it's in Thomaston. It's beautiful and it's hilarious because they'll like fight in midair and they're like these little tuxedo birds. It's adorable. But it's also this beautiful, big, inviting field. And so I would often get comments of people like, man, I love it here. Like I can let my dog run free and you can see them. They're out chasing birds and having a great time. And, you know, knowing a little more about the reason that preserve exists, I'm seeing birds flying for their life. I'm seeing nests get trampled. I'm seeing young birds getting eaten by dogs, which is a real shame because it's an endangered species. And that's the reason we protect that landscape. And so unfortunately this year we had to close Riverview hayfields altogether to dog access. I should also say, because it's the nature of the webinar, that there were many people, of course, not picking up after their dogs, even those that were leashed. Poor David did water monitoring off of our Riverview hayfields preserve or adjacent, and you can really just see a gross trail from various dog owners as they enter the preserve, walking in from the parking lot, of a number of people who just either didn't think or they weren't prepared or they forgot to pick up after their dogs. Not to mention, when a dog is off leash, it's out in the woods, it's out in the field, you're not going to see it go to the bathroom, and more likely, even if you do, you're not going to go pick it up because you're supposed to stay on trail. So no one would want to break the rules and go off trail and pick up after it, but people don't know the impact that dogs can have. And so what we thought was a pretty reasonable request and a pretty reasonable rule turned into a bit of a exercise in patience and public outreach, as we got a good deal of pushback, because it's been somewhere that it's a beautiful area. People love bringing their pets there. And even within our organization, we got a lot of pushback. I wrote down a few of my favorite quotes of our own committee members and volunteers, calling it a blow to public access, too sudden and confrontational, and things along that lines. And in reality, it's closing 1 mile of trail versus 70, where we do allow dogs and we encourage people to pick up after them. And so it took a while, but a few of our own members stuck up for this. We were trying to be very patient and listen to everyone. And come 2 weeks after we made the decision, we had a Trails Committee meeting, and I came in all geared up with like facts and information. I was trying to be patient. And I realized as I sit down, I'm like, so the dogs thing. And all of these people who just a week before had been quite upset all go, it makes sense. And I was like, oh, really? I came in already for an argument, and suddenly everyone with a little bit of time to cool off, and they're like, well, we thought about it, and it seems pretty reasonable, especially considering Thomaston has other options for dog walking. And so I'm sorry for tangenting so long on what it's like to talk to people about dog issues, but what I've encountered as someone who does a lot of that is it's a lot of knee-jerk reactions that come from a place of caring for our dogs. And caring about what we usually do and that sort of thing, and not necessarily from many of the facts and the in-depth information that we've talked about here, because people just haven't learned what the impact is. It's hard to imagine that your dog could contribute to such large issues for other people, and of course you'd never want that. And so what we're trying to do is hold a nice little bit of balance and pay attention to how our lands are used, especially when, our namesake is the St. George River and we care so much about it. We want to make sure that we are holding ourselves accountable and making sure our lands are being used responsibly. And so we're trying to put out messaging and trying to take part in things like this because it's important that people can enjoy the outdoors and connect with them. And it's definitely possible to do it while protecting them without, making too many people upset. So thank you all so much for listening to us tonight. And I think I'll hand it back off to you because that's all that I had prepared.
That is
Mhm.
great. Thanks, Matt. So I'm someone who cares very much about their dogs and them getting exercise, but again, I'm also someone who cares very deeply about our marine environment and our shorebirds as well. And I'm just wondering, what do you think, Matt, is, I'll kind of start off with some questions. What do you think is the best way, if we do interact with someone who's not picking up their dog waste, what is something that we can do as individuals to help in, coastal ecosystems, to help alleviate this issue for shellfish and for birds and other wildlife as well?
Well, it's of course never an easy conversation. You can, apply a similar idea to the concept of just littering in general. People who, even if by accident or on purpose, maybe unthinkingly, lose an item out of their car, throw something on the side of the sidewalk ahead of you. And, we're all generally non-confrontational people, but when it comes to dog waste, and especially in proximity to water, I think it's appropriate to, very politely, I'm not saying like chase down this person on trail and tackle them. But, someone politely be like, oh, excuse me, I think you missed your dog, go to the bathroom back there. Or, always assume the best at first is my, the first thing I do when I talk to folks. And then if it seems like it's going to escalate, it's best not, I appreciate it. I don't want you getting into a fist fight to protect my trail from dog waste. Although I appreciate your dedication to the cause. And so always be kind and polite if you think if it's anything unsafe, or some, people have unsafe dogs sometimes. You never want to put yourself in a difficult position, but I think saying something politely, trying once is enough to send the message. And if it's someone who it would work on, it likely will the first time. People will likely also forget sometimes, say it's an honest mistake. And to that, you can always say like, oh, okay, well, as long as you remember next time, or like just give them a little, so the next time they have that little bit in the back of their head. Something my mom would do when people litter is that assumption, like, oh, you forgot that. And it's it sort of puts them in the position of like, I should really go pick that up myself.
Sure. Brian, I have a question for you, and David could chime in as well if he would like. But we're talking about these pollutants in the water and how it's affecting the seafood that's people eating. I'm just curious, how often are we monitoring, or how are you monitoring different waterways that are being used for shellfish harvesting and for clamming?
At the MR, we monitor all harvesting areas at least 6 times a year for the sake of water quality. And then we use a 5-year statistic. So you might go one day and there happened to have been a little bit of a spike, but we're not going to just immediately close it. So we look at 5 years worth of data, but we go 6 times a year, sometimes more. And with biotoxins, we make different trips for that. And during biotoxin season, which is basically May through, can be October, could be December where that ends, we'll be going weekly for the sake of biotoxins to areas of high risk that we're following blooms around the coastline. So we are monitoring these areas very frequently.
Great, that's good to hear. We do have a question in the chat. Barbara would like to know, what are the effects on the environment of dog urine? She knows it burns plants, but wonders about toxicity in the watershed. And And is there a handout or a QR code or something that can be passed out to people? I think is kind of her question about the problems of dog waste, and kind of just making people aware. I always say, you know, education sometimes is really half the battle. And as long as you educate someone and they understand, then they can kind of make an informed decision or an informed action.
So to the first part about dog urine, that's not a concern for the sake of shellfish sanitation. There as you point out in the question, there can be other implications for dog urine that's not good on where the urine is on shore, but it's the feces that's where the bacteria is going to be present. Urine's sterile in terms of bacteria. So that's not an issue for shellfish if the dog happened to pee in the water, or if it peed and got into a brook or something. And as far as a handout, I don't have something immediately to give. I'll look to see if there's something. We don't have something we produced, but I might be able to find a link to something that has been produced. For the citation I use for the amount of fecal concentrations, which David and I we get a gold star because we both cited the same fecal concentration. So
I noticed that.
we use, if you go online, you can see every kind of Dr. Dog Poop and Mr. Dog Poop websites out there, and they got numbers all over the place. And we didn't use that. But anyway, I'll look and see if we've had something. A lot of different organizations have put out good literature in the past about dog waste, and there's been a lot of good publicity that's come out, which is one of the effective ways I've seen in the past, where when a community's known about chronic dog waste issues that are impacting shellfish harvesting areas, sometimes just having a sign up. Matt mentioned somebody saying how glad they were they didn't have to worry about dog waste when there was a sign right there saying you do have to worry about dog waste. So that's happened in the past, and I've then heard afterwards that people responded to those handouts and those brochures because they just didn't make the connection. I mean, you just don't think about dog waste and a clam.
Sure, yeah.
It's just down the hill. So I'll check to see if I have something, and maybe I can give that to Carrie Ann if I do.
Yeah, that would be great. I'd be happy to pass it along. Let's see, we got a couple more questions coming in here. Will there be community ordinances to deal with dog waste polluting the waters? And anyone can kind of chime in. I'm not sure if that's a Matt question.
David might be able to correct me on this, but I recently joined, because he's been working in this with us a little longer than I have, but I recently joined the Thomaston Conservation Commission, as this has sort of been a developing topic. And in my experience, there's no state law restricting or about regulating dog waste. There are leash laws which are surprisingly strict, that I find people don't realize how strict they are. However, frequently there are town ordinances. I know, what's Thomaston's? It's $100 first offense, $500 second offense, and those on. But it's usually just like if you don't clean up after your dog, and it doesn't include water quality. But it's possible that, at least in Thomaston, there could be an update to that somewhat soon.
All right. Wow, questions are flying in here. Okay. So during the course of the past few decades, have you noticed an increase in the amount of dog feces polluting the water, or has it been consistent? And I'd kind of like to add to that a little bit. David, have you seen any areas where the water quality has really plummeted, versus have you also seen any areas where the water quality has actually gotten better?
There's been areas that's been getting better. We have recently, with Brian's help, opened up what the area called in Thomaston, the Bay, which George's, Matt knows that their land trust runs along. That's been improving. We still have some areas off to the side we got to work on. But I noticed a lot, and dog waste is a big concern because when we have rain in areas that's up on Main Street in Thomaston, it washes into the storm drains and ends up in the ocean, in the rivers. And I noticed after a rain or storm, a lot of stuff, we get 1 inch of rain and we go and condition our areas, which Brian could probably explain better than I can. We get 1 inch of rain, they're closed. And I've tested all the way down to a Fort Point after 1 inch rain, and I noticed we always get dog waste. Always get a lot of dog showing up on a DNA test. So, and one of the reasons it could be too is our salinity from Fort Point up is less than 29, and it takes 29 or higher to start breaking down fecal matter of any kind. So that river is really a delicate balance between any fecal matter and, staying healthy. And since dog is something we can try to control, the people need to be educated. We got signs up, but there's always a few that just ignore them, and that's just the way it is. I'm hoping Matt's working, I hope, on that committee with Thomaston. I hope they start going out and checking a little harder where they got for the dog waste manager, and maybe we can clean them out to that small percentage up. But basically, that's about all I got, I guess.
Yeah, well, and it's, I think it's important to note here that, the rivers are carrying down dog waste, and it's ending up in estuaries, it's ending up in brackish water where it can't necessarily be broken down and affecting some marine organisms that live there. So really, I always like to say a healthy watershed, everyone benefits from it. We do, different animals do. It sounds like, these birds do, the bobolinks and the clams, and and we do, it's all connected. Let's see, we have a couple more questions in here. So during the course of the past few decades, is the dog feces increased in the past few decades dramatically, or is it just kind of steadily increasing over time, or is the same amount, or do we not know?
I'll say one thing that it ties in with what David had just said. So David is one of the David's involved with one of the handful of towns along the coast that's been doing their own water quality sampling that's for the sake of DNA testing. What DMR does, we just look at the bacteria. We have no clue of the source just from our water quality tests. It just says this much of this kind of bacteria was present. Warm-blooded animal, human, we don't know. So this is a new technology, this DNA technology, that can actually say the source. So we don't have a long history of data that can be specific like that to say dog, other than we kind of would sort it out circumstantially in the past. So we would see high scores and would look at the area, and maybe it was a public park where there was just always dog waste on the shore. So we just assume that's the cause. And maybe if ordinances were put in or signs were put up, whatever it was, and then you see the scores drop, we presume that we fixed the problem, but we just don't have that data evidence that can say it, yes, for sure. But that's starting to be built up by some communities, like what the Georges River group is doing. So that's something that we can't say for sure, but going forward, I think we'll start to be able to answer that question.
Yeah, great. So is it just dog waste that's causing a problem, or are there other animals that are impacting ecosystem? And you may have touched on this. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think someone mentioned, we're feeding our dogs different food than, let's say a beaver would go out, and find food, natural foods in the forest, and this is human-made dog food that we're feeding our dogs. So there's, I guess, a more negative impact, and you can chime in, but I think that's kind of the gist that I understood.
Well, I was the one that said the dog is what we feed. I Googled that, and plus I've talked to a lot of biologists, and they said that it's what we feed the dogs that make some of their fecal matter so bad, because it is a high rich protein diet and it has a lot of chemicals. And dog waste just sits there, and Brian can back me up on this. It just sits there on land waiting for rain, and then just growing back more bacteria in the sun. And then when it hits the fresh water, I think it was Brian or Jeffrey that told me this, dog waste multiplies in fresh water even more. So versus wildlife, yes, wildlife is a problem too, but we can't shoot every beaver, and we can't kill every deer and muskrat or the professor I work with is down on the DNA testing. He said a lot of it is otters, believe it or not. He says an otter will pick one spot on land, and they'll swim up that stream, and that's where they use that for a latrine. He goes, and then when it rains, that's all that accumulation will wash down into the watershed. And he says, and that will give you a bad score. He says more often it's otters and beavers. So I've asked if people off and on if they ever seen any otters in our rivers. And yes, even though I haven't seen them, there is otters. So that's going by what the information I have.
An issue that we have with, most of the main coastline's rural and not well developed. So there's wildlife across the whole shore, yet most of the shoreline is open for shellfish harvesting. So just the sake that there's wildlife present in and of itself doesn't usually result in closures. But one thing to consider would be, you have something like beavers living in an area. Well, everyone's not bringing their pet beaver to the same spot to use the bathroom. But that's exactly what we're doing with our dogs. Never mind the amount of bacteria that's not all poop's made the same. So some has a lot more fecal coliform bacteria in it than others, and dog waste is one of the higher content ones out there. So we're taking this animal that produces a lot of fecal coliform bacteria, and we're all bringing them to the same spot to walk on the same trail. And my dogs are the same thing. The second I take them for a walk, they go, "Oh, great, this is bathroom time." So and I'm sure every dog's the same way. So we're effectively all bringing them to these spots to treat as their bathrooms. Well, not deer don't all get herded to the same spot, and the beavers and everything. So they're at least spreading it out versus what we're artificially doing, bringing them all the same. We bring them all to the Georges River Land Trust Trail, and then David tries to go clamming the next day after, and it rains, and good. Now he has a 9-day closure because of that. So it's definitely a difference because of our human behavior of concentrating these animals. Same thing with the dog, with a park. I shouldn't have said dog park, but a park or any public access where they're allowed to go.
Yeah, that's a good point. If you take a dog out of the ecosystem is still going to exist and thrive without it. If you take some of these other wild animals out of the ecosystem, it could potentially collapse. So a very good point. And you mentioned, I know it was just an example, Bryant, but you mentioned, it could mean a 9-day closure for clammers, like David. And David, I'd like to just kind of end with, what does a 9-day, when you hear a 9-day closure or a clamor is faced with a 9-day closure, I mean, what are the repercussions, or what are some of the impacts of that?
Loss of income for the diggers. The Georgia River Shellfish Committee, they have 77 resident diggers, 10 out-of-town diggers. By law, we have to have that, and it affects their income because they depend on this watershed being open to harvest. And if we get a 2-inch rain, which Brian can tell you, we actually shut down the whole area. And if they get a 2-inch rain, the whole state, they shut the whole state down. Versus a 1 inch of rainfall, they just shut down our conditional areas. So it does affect the diggers. If they get shut down for 9 days because of 2 inches of rain, then they've lost that 1 week's worth of income. And at this, with everything in the economy where it is now, that's a lot of money. Especially if, when the price is up for them.
Sure, yeah. So, really asking someone to walk their dog somewhere else or pick up their dog waste is a really small effort, on their part, or really small impact compared to losing a week's worth of wages there. So thank you for sharing that.
Not to interrupt you, but actually we've had over 30 days of rain in the past, where in the course of a year. So actually they've lost a whole month's income, diggers have in the past.
Wow.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. So
Yeah, I know. I think a lot of us would be very upset if we found out that we lost a month's worth of income. And so I think we can all sort of do our part to pick up our dog waste and to encourage others to do the same. All right, I don't want to take up too much more of everyone's time. So thank you very much to Bryant, Matt, and David for spending time with us and sharing your experiences and your expertise. Thank you everyone for joining us and sharing an interest in our community watershed health. We appreciate your support. Next month's Learn, Discover, Grow event will be on Tuesday, November 15th at 7 p.m. And this will be the 3rd event in our watershed series this fall. Join us to continue learning about watersheds from the fresh to salt. And thank you again to all in attendance this evening. And I hope you have a wonderful night, and I hope to see you next month.
Thank you all so much for coming. And thank you, Carrie Ann, for hosting. This was a blast.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you so much.
And I'd like to thank
That was
all of
wonderful.
you. And Brian too, he was a big help, and Matt was too. Thank you.
Yes, it was
Thank
great.
you.
All right, good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Bye.